All right, I want to do just a little bit on the history of kind of the child development field. I'm taking what you're seeing on your screen straight from the reading that you're going to be doing, but I wanted to give it a little bit more context. So I'm going to talk us through a little bit of the theories and some of the things that socially might have been going on or kind of contexts that we now have. So one of the great things about history is that we have the ability to kind of look back and see, strengths and vulnerabilities. So I'm going to try to provide a little bit more context to some of these developmentalists from history that we will study and maybe not study. So some of these people that I'm going to be introducing are just to give you a little bit more information about how this field started. And some of them are just a brief introduction to theorists that we'll learn a little bit more from or hear a little bit more from throughout this course. So, as a species, we've had kind of culture as we know it for 50 to 60,000 years. So that's kind of when we evolved and we started kind of human civilization. We can see our first civilization starting actually in Australia, in Africa, East Africa, and then also kind of in that Fertile Crescent and kind of the Iraq area in the Middle East area. So that's where our kind of first civilizations are. And we would have had a lot of information about children, and it would have come straight from what we have kind of observed about children. So people have always been observing infants, observing pregnancy, observing how people learn and grow. But it wasn't until we started kind of having a more written record that we have been able to kind of look at how we view children. And it's changed a lot even within our written records. So if we're looking from like the 1400s, 1500s, when writing became more prevalent in Europe primarily, then we kind of have this historical record to kind of look back on. Childhood has changed significantly though. In the 1400s and 1500s, when we're first kind of looking at Martin Luther, who was a religious scholar, and Comenius, who also was somebody who was also looking at childhood. Childhood was not so long. It was probably only infant, toddler, and maybe a little bit of a 3 and 4 year old. Primarily what happened around the world was, you stayed with your mother primarily because you were breastfeeding and nursing. And after that, then a lot of your care was taken by extended family members and a lot of siblings. So older siblings would take care of younger siblings. And children would start learning about the farm, the community, their job, maybe as like a brick builder or doing welding or whatever it was, blacksmithing, it would be welding, whatever it was, whatever your job in the community was, you would start learning that very, very early, and it was typically followed by families. We don't really have that kind of society anymore. In certain cultures we do. For the most part in the United States, where we're learning about child development, we have a very long period of childhood, so much so that we have all these classes about it, right? We have our infant toddler classes, we learn about middle childhood, we learn about adolescence. There's even now kind of emerging adulthood, which is, kind of your 20s and things like that, where, maybe we're delaying having kids of our own. So you're kind of exploring being an adult, exploring your career before you kind of jump into full adulthood. That did not exist a long time ago. So we kind of have to look at a lot of these theorists like Martin Luther, John Locke, and Rousseau, and think back in that time, children weren't the children we think of today. They were thought of as much younger. Also, most children didn't get an education at this time. And if they did, they were very wealthy. They were either the daughters of someone high up in the church, or sons and daughters of someone in a church, or they were very rich or going to be royalty or something like that, the sons and daughters of merchants, for example. People who were not in those classes did not get education. You weren't taught to read, and it would be very unusual that you were. So a lot of these theorists in Europe were advocating for us to learn how to read more and to have a specific education. And that was considered very revolutionary, was to have everybody learn how to read. When we first started teaching people to read, it was primarily in Europe, and it was primarily for men who would have been considered white. daughters and women were not supposed to learn how to read. It was considered dangerous. And then this is also when kind of slavery and slave trades happened. We had some kind of colonial influences, and not teaching people who were considered not white to read, that would have been considered revolutionary as well. So we kind of have to consider that within this context. When we kind of started having this written view of child development, what was going on at the time? So it was very small amounts of people who were rich and white who were allowed to kind of have education. So we did have some great kind of ideas, such as Martin Luther. He kind of started the Protestant Revolution. So not so much Catholicism, but opening up to different kind of religions started back in with Martin Luther, who our Martin Luther King Jr. was kind of named after. So he really wanted family to educate children, but he really wanted children to learn how to read. Once again, we can kind of look at what children did he want to read, what children did he not want to read, but the idea of universal education kind of goes back to that. Then we have John Amos, who actually started an alphabet book, books about nature, so kind of our first picture books. A lot of that was also being done by women in the home who would embroider so that they would get like a needle and thread, and they would do pictures on large pieces of fabric, and teach children how to read and write in the home doing that as well. So his was kind of the first mass-produced one, but a lot of women and people in families were trying to do this at home using the materials that were available to them, because you wouldn't, if you were just a middle class, lower class, working class family, you wouldn't have at this point access to pens and paper. It was very, very, very expensive and handmade. So you would do with what you had, which was typically you could find some cloth and you could embroider the ABCs, you could embroider pictures on it in order to kind of teach children. Then John Locke, a lot of our ideas previous to this had to do with our religious take on children, which was kind of original sin, and seeing children as maybe inherently bad and having to correct their behavior. John Locke, and then Rousseau as well, kind of thought that children were neutral. Locke is famous for saying the tabula rasa for children, which is a clean slate in Latin, but something that we could write on, something that we could change as well. Rousseau took it a little bit farther. He would probably be considered the hippie of this era. He had these ideas about children constructing their own knowledge, and then he was one of the first people to kind of write down and say, you know, an infant and toddler's ideas and perspectives are going to be very different than me in my 40s, right? He was one of the people who kind of took us through that as well. So this is giving us a little bit more context on how we're thinking. Why do we need you to kind of understand that? Well, this is a field that has a lot of information in it. Not just people who wrote it down, but also throughout the ages, we have stories from Africa and Mexico and things like that about children and how children grow. So kind of folk stories and storytelling about how to educate children, because outside of Europe, a lot of our knowledge was not written down. A lot of our community and cultural knowledge was repeated in very long stories, or things that you would kind of communicate with others when you had our communities or our extended families together. So that's where we kind of start to understand how a long time ago people viewed children, which helps give us a perspective on how do we view children now? How has the past influenced what we've done today? So from there, we kind of have some people who in the 1700s and 1800s did try to kind of change education a little bit more as well. Froebel, if you've gone to kindergarten, you got to thank Froebel. So he was a German right after kind of Rousseau, who started the children's garden, which is what a kindergarten is. That's German for children's garden, or kinder is children, garden is garden. And so it was a place kind of outside of a parent's sphere of influence where you could go and play really hands-on with the things that we see now. A lot of that was supported by Maria Montessori, who was the first doctor, an actual physician who lives in Italy. But she took her, during the 1940s, she actually got, she was traveling and the World War broke out, and she was in India. And so she learned a lot from Indian culture and put a lot of her educational foundations with them as well. And she was all about materials and environments and very respectful of children. She was one of the first to work with poor children and saw their need for education, which kind of not always been, while Horace Mann was very much about equity, and so was Maria Montessori, but I would consider them some of our first ones who kind of really thought about vulnerable children, poor children, and children with special needs, and bringing them into education to make it more equitable for everybody. And then in the 1861 to 1925 was Rudolf Steiner. My grandmother was born in 1925. So you can kind of think we're getting closer and closer to our theory now. So if my grandmother was born in 1925, Steiner would have really influenced her education. Influenced, she went to kindergarten, she went to all the way through high school and then university, which in the 1940s was fairly unheard of. So we're seeing some shifts and changes in how we see children. And now it's a lot more common for children to go to preschools or kindergartens. And now we're expecting them to go to school all the way to 18. And we're starting to have universities open to women as well. Actually, my grandmother majored in math. And in the 1940s, that was really, really unheard of. She said she was the only woman in a few of her classes, and there was another woman in some of her upper division classes as well. So she was kind of breaking some barriers in Ohio, kind of wanting to learn about math, when before that, we know it might not have been, STEM might have not been considered an appropriate place for a woman as well. So in the 1800s and 1900s, we've really seen a blooming and a blossoming of our understanding of children. So we've been able to have physicians take a look at children, take a look at their brains, see how they're learning, and we're adding to this theory every year. So one of the ones that I learned a lot in the 1990s was considered the Reggio Emilia approach, once again out of Italy, but it's very much about projects, about being hands-on, about children making and communicating to other people about what they're learning as well. So you can see that as society changes, as cultures and communities change, our theorists come out of that time and make ideas about it now. So that is just some context. We're going to be learning about some of these other people throughout the class. Some of them I'm just touching on now to give you that context of this field has always been changing and will continue to always change as we understand more about families and children. All right, thanks so much, and I'll see you guys more online.